Dear all, on behalf of Gitika Trust, I welcome you for being here today with us. I appreciate your being here to observe the memory of my mother, Kalyani Sengupta. Kalyani Sengupta was born in Khulna in the year 1923 in Bengal Presidency of Undivided India. To Kalyani, Amar Sonar Bangla reflected the world of her childhood in Khulna, which is currently situated in Bangladesh, where she witnessed every day golden paddy fields at sunrise, cattle returning to villages at dusk, the shaded path by the river bank that she traversed on her way to school, and the mango orchards where she would play with her sisters. In the 1930s, when Gandhiji gave a call to civil disobedience movement, the 9-year-old Kalyani compiled a little collection of songs that mobilized people for freedom struggle. Kalyani named it Amar Swadeshi Ganer Bhandar, that included Gurudev's composition Jana Gana, that was long before independent India adopted it as her national anthem in 1950. So, how does a girl learn to identify a song with her childhood memories and use another as a call for national action? Well, I do not know what was definitely in Kalyani's mind, but from my study of the generation of Indians who witnessed India's journey to independence and partition, these songs have often been interpreted differently from one's lived experiences. So for Kalyani, I suppose, Amar Sonar Bangla possibly captured the essence of her homeland, long lost to the partition of India, while Jana Gana Mana, on the other hand, reminded her about the dream of free India that Gandhiji inspired in his Satyagraha protests or prayer meetings, or even Netaji inspired in his iconic radio broadcasts. As Kolani built her new home in the new land with her new neighbors from all corners of India after partition, Janagana Mana for her encapsulated the core values of India. The first stanza of Janagana Mana says, or rather lays down, the framework of India's situated sovereignty. The second embodies unity in diversity. The third refers to the philosophies of ancient rishis, or perhaps Krishna as Arjun's charioteer expounding the laws of dharma. The fourth stanza illustrates Mother India's assurances for her children. And the fifth and the final stanza indicates the new dawn when India wakes up to realize the true purpose. Kalyani cherished these values till her last. It would be fair to say then that Kalyani engaged with the two songs in different ways, but she was not a scholar, nor was she trained to analyze such songs academically. My professional and personal interest in this regard led me to a scholarly article, Rabindranath Tagore's Samaj, or Communities of Song, by Dr. Peter D. McDonald. I read the article with great interest and could not wait to share the fascinating insights with all of you. Peter went beyond the confines of his own first language, English, and its many cultures, taking cue, as he acknowledged, from Tagore's view of education as an intercultural project. It is great honor for us that Peter is here to a conversation today as we observe Kalyani Sengupta's memorial. I take great pleasure in introducing Dr. Peter McDonald, Professor of English and Related Literature and Fellow of St. Hugh's College, Oxford. Peter is the author of several books, to name a few: The Double Life of books, making and remaking the reader, artifacts of writing, ideas of the state and communities of letters from Matthew Arnold to Zhu Bing, the literature police, apartheid censorship, and its cultural consequences. British literary culture and publishing practice, 1880 to 1914. Currently, he is working on a book about reimagining a literary education in the age of artificial intelligence. It is my pleasure to call upon my friend and colleague for the last 40 years, Dr. Aditi Dasgupta, to conduct the conversation. Dr. Aditi Dasgupta is retired associate professor and former head of the Department of English, Loreto College, Kolkata. Welcome, Peter, and over to you, Aditi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sujata, and a very good afternoon to you, Dr. McDonald. It's a privilege to be able to engage in conversation with you, especially after, I've looked at that very interesting essay that you have written, which Sujata shared with me. One of the first things that I would like to ask you is what exactly inspired you to explore this subject, which, as we know, is really in a language that is not really familiar to you, and yet, you have obviously done a fair amount of research and you've thought deeply about it. So, what really led you to inspire Rabindranath's communities of song?
Great, thank you so much, and thanks for this invitation, which as I was saying before we started, was unexpected and all the more wonderful for being unexpected. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and also fascinating to hear Sujata talk about her mother and that kind of lived relationship to these things. I mean, I very much hope you write that up at some point, because it is extraordinary that she, in the 1930s, had that idea of putting these two things together, which then had of course I've only learned that now, but which then had these two songs had this extraordinary afterlife. But yeah, from my point of view, so there's one side of it is a very, in some ways, a dull explanation as to why I unfortunately wasn't initially inspired. I was sort of asked to do this because some people here in Oxford actually organized a conference called Rethinking Lyric Communities, and they asked me if I would contribute to that conference. So the initial prompt was simply to give a talk, in fact, is what I gave just from some notes at that conference, and I used this, but and then I subsequently, they asked me to write it up as an essay for that publication, so I had to do a bit more work to try to do that. But it was also the reason why I elected to talk about this was it was something left over from the book that Sujata mentioned about called Artifacts of Writing, which I published in 2017. And among other things, in that book, I used Tagore and James Joyce in particular as two kind of iconic figures of the similar historical moment, obviously doing very, very different things, but also leading extraordinarily interconnected and parallel lives, despite their massive differences. And one of the ways in which they converge, at least as I have always seen it, is that they both asked really radical questions about the foundations of the modern state. So this is in the book Artifacts of Writing, whether that state is colonial or post-colonial, and about statist ideas of community. They both posed those questions to me. And I mean, to make things even worse, the Joyce figure that I'm talking about here, making links to Tagore, is the Joyce of Finnegan's Wake, which is famously and iconically the most unreadable book in the world. But I've always seen a very powerful partly political motivation behind what Joyce was doing to the English language in that case. So there were those parallels. But of course, there was also a crucial difference between Tagore and Joyce, and that is that Joyce did not become the official laureate of two states, but Tagore did. So that's a major difference. So the essay, in a sense, became an opportunity for me to reflect on Tagore's extraordinary afterlife in India and Bangladesh as the official laureate of those two independent nations once that history worked itself out from the, as we all know, from 1947 to the 1970s. But it also, the other key thing, and this is why I'm such a interloper in this lot, is that I also saw this as an opportunity for me to do something I think of, and as Sujata intimated, as deeply Tagorean. That is to throw myself. This is what I've always taken from Tagore, and in some ways I take a similar sort of lesson from Joyce. But it's the Tagore is the leading figure on this. To throw myself into a language and culture that is not my own, where I can make absolutely no claim to be at home, and where I simply do not know my way about. And so I have to rely on other people. I talk to people. I have friends who help me with Bengali scholars who help me with translation, and I use everything I can. But I have always understood the point of Tagore's educational projects is this deeply intercultural thing, which is deeply about throwing yourself into things where you clearly don't belong, and then you must try to do something about that and do something with that, ideally primarily for your own culture and language. So for me, it's part of that project. I mean, that's why Tagore was also part of Artifacts of Writing. I had to get out of my, I've never been comfortable and at home in my so-called English culture, because there's also reasons why I would be suspicious of aspects of its culture and history and the language. But for Tagore, I've always had this. That's the inspiration: is to make that risk, to make that plunge.
The risk that comes with opening your doors wide open. Right?
Exactly. Exactly right.
Go in and go out.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And even if the wind might blow the door off the hinges.
Yes, I see that. Thank you. The two songs that are central to the article that you've written, Amar, Sonar Bangla, and Jana Gana. How would you compare them, not as anthems, but as songs? In what ways would you think of them as being similar, and in what ways would they be dissimilar?
So the point of the article, why I sort of focused on these two things, because this is another aspect of what I've always been interested in my own work, is that when we not only when we commit things to writing, but when we speak and are using language, but certainly when we commit things to writing, then you immediately open up a really complicated history to these things, which is that so the question I wanted to address was in the article was what happens to songs or lyric poems, as we were focusing on in the conference, that were originally composed in really very specific contexts and moments. What happens to those songs that then they have that occasional weight to them? There's a history, a moment, an intense moment. But then what happens when they are transformed into state anthems? And that makes them something radically different. I mean, one of the things is, of course, they are abridged. The Jana Gana and Amar are not the whole song isn't used for the anthem, but there's also other things that change. And of course, one of the most dramatic things that happens is that they become part of a formal process, and they are sung and memorized across generations. So these these things suddenly become something. So, that's again why I was fascinated by what Sujata was saying about her mother, collecting that because of her lived experience. But then her lived experience has now been, curated as these extraordinary anthems that have survived. So what I do in the essay is track that history and identifying the ways in which the songs, if you like, inhabit a tension. That on the one hand, they articulate an open, inclusive, mobile sense of community, but on the other hand, they've been institutionalized as state symbols and anthems. And as the songs become anthems, they both reinforce collective belonging and quite clearly, but they also risk being stripped of their original layered resonances and meanings. I mean, there's an inevitable consequence of being what I turn it into a verb, anthemized. What happens to a song when it's anthemized? So that was the big question. But you've also asked me about the similarities and the differences, and this is again also goes a long way to my, well, I mean, it's where I have to rely on others and take guidance from others and start to, but this is again one of the things that I find particularly fascinating is that. So, well, I mean, let me start with the similarity. The obvious similarity is that they were both written at moments of intense public agitation or reflection in the history of India. What was happening with Amar Bangla, written amid the 1905 anti-partition Swadeshi movement. There's that charged history which is there. It's only there by a thread in the anthem version. It's only the hint of that sadness. It's not the last part where it's actually more explicit is not part of the anthem, the Swadeshi moment. But the poem that yields Jana Gana was initially Tagore's extraordinarily affronted response to being asked to compose something for George V's official pomp and ceremony visit to India in 1911. So he was asked to do that, and he produced this, which is and that's part of its history. I mean, that's also a fascinating thing. But so there's that, the charged moments of their moments of origin, but the thing that's also, again, what's drawn me to Tagore, which is again a sort of connection I see with Joyce in particular, but also others. We maybe talk about Yeats later on, but if we think of them as songs and so not as anthems, the wonderful thing is they show how Tagore worked. I mean, increasingly across his career, but he worked across the classical and vernacular divide. With again, as I've understood the history of Bangla as a language and so on, for Tagore there would be that formal high register, Shadu Basha inheritance, but then he increasingly moved in the sort of his own version of a kind of a cholito, the vernacular, colloquial, if I can use those words, direction. So Jana Gana, there's, from a melody point of view, as preserved in Tagore's notation, is set in Indo-classical mode. It's even musically, it's the high register classical raga, and it has a measured, to my ear, just even again, I'm really, I mean, I literally cannot understand Bangla. I don't have that competence, but so I'm also fascinated by that, by what I don't know, because I can't. When you hear it, you hear meaning. I hear. Actually, the best I can do is hear the melody, and then I can think, okay, what does that melody? How does that melody sound to me? And of course, who am I in terms of what I know about Indian? So that just my ear, has to learn to deal with these things a little bit. And but even to my ear, it has that kind of measured hymn-like, stately sweep, and I know also from its history that it's kind of a Brahmo hymn in that way. It has that elevation to it. But Amar Shona, it's rooted in the Bangla folk, especially a tradition that via Tagore and various other things I've got fascinated in, which is the Baul tradition. And again, forgive all my mangled pronunciations, which are part of the problem we are talking about. But there, it seems to me, this is going much more in the Cholitio language, the colloquial vernacular, but it's also based on that Baul tune, which is attributed to Gagan Harkara, and it uses this more folk rhythmic cycles, and has, to my ear, again, a much more lilting vernacular feel, just listening to the song. And again, I would love to know how all of you hear that and how that compares to how I hear that. But even, coming from my depths of ignorance, I can hear the kind of folk vernacular feel, even of the melody, and I know in terms of the language that he's using versus the more elevated raga plus elevated register and diction of Shadu Bhasha. So that those are the things that I've been fascinated by. But what's most fascinating for me and about Tagore is that his whole career is made out of crossing those boundaries, mixing those things up, moving from one to the other, capable of doing both, but also moving in that more colloquial direction. But that's extraordinary.
I don't think your ear has let you down at all, because
Oh, really?
The contrast in the melodic moods of the two songs, I think that comes through whether or not you have Bangla. With Jana Gana Mono, once it was being prepared to be the national anthem, there were many there were many experiments about how it should be orchestrated. And
right, I'm sure
that Western orchestration was certainly part of that history. When the song was first played on AIR and all of this, there was that Western musical framework as well for it.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was a sort of, they were giving a deliberate sense of kind of using, but also probably using Western models of anthems.
Exactly.
Is that that's fascinating? Yeah, great. Yeah.
I don't think there was anything similar with Amar Sonar Bangla when Bangladesh decided on it as the national anthem.
Right.
I'm going to ask you something entirely different, and this one focus specifically on Jana Gana Mono, which is the question of gender in this song. The figure of
the dispenser.
Jana Gana Mono Odhinayako. Would you like to comment on the use of gender in this poem?
So again, I was really interested in that question, and I do have I've through friends, through some doing bits of homework, because it's also one of the things that becomes a real problem and a question for translators is the way that the difference between how Bangla handles gender and how English handles gender. That that creates a real issue where actually you can have lots of things that in Bangla will be not gender marked, which would be in English, and so on and so forth. So that it poses a challenge. So I was really interested in thinking this through. So that and again, there are people with much more expertise than me in the audience, and besides the fact that you've all got a lived relationship to the language, which is beyond anything I can muster. But it's so the most powerful thing that comes across is that you do have this addressee. It's an exhortation to a you, and the you is the dispenser of Indian's destiny in the English translation. And as I understand that, the you certainly in a kind of, if we think about it in this formalized Sanskrit Bangla Shadu Bhasha, that is marked from a masculine, just conventionally. It's marked as masculine, but as I read the poem and understand it, it would be in some ways a bit odd to think of that as being somehow marked in some highly specific gendered way, because in that higher register, again, as I've understood the tradition and the language at that point, when you're talking about some sort of idealized, abstract figure, you're not bringing with it. There's a kind of a universalizing, however it might be now questionable, but there's a universalizing. It's just how abstractions can be exalted in that with that grammatical marking. But having said that, again, to my ear and via the translations and thinking about it in the larger context of Tagore's thinking and approach to things, I would say the figure is, if not androgynous, then at least gender unmarked. And I think I probably have a couple of reasons for that. Why I would err on that side in answer directly to your question. If not androgynous, then somehow ungendered. And that the addressed figure is not explicitly, I think, and people could correct me if I'm wrong, identified as male or female at any point, nor it's described as belonging to any gendered social role. So it's not as if there's a specific social role. The effect, if you like, is the language is drawing. So again, it's drawing on the Shadubashu tradition, where there's often masculine grammatical forms by default for abstract entities or universal ideals. And that's, again, I think is not the same as a specifically male subject. So the effect of, as I take it, of the hymn is to evoke an inclusive communal subject. It's all peoples, it's India's destiny, it's that encompassing. And so it's more a lyrical device than it is a kind of any kind of assertion of a particular gendered identity. So those, again, that's just how I've read it and responded to it. But I guess for me, the decisive thing about the gendered, the non-gendered reading, the ungendered, it's not marked as gender, or even as androgynous, is the fact that he said in a letter, Tagore says in a letter, the dispenser of India's destiny is not any George. No, not George the First, not George the Second, not George the Fifth. No way, no, absolutely. So the Lord of Destiny, who has from age to age held steadfast the reins of India's chariot, is absolutely no British male monarch. So I think the ungendered reading of it would carry that. If you allow that context to carry the weight, then I think that, to my mind, wins the argument for it being gender unspecified and deliberate on Tagore's part to be that.
Thank you, because this is obviously in contrast to Amar Sonar Bangla, where
yes,
the mother figure is so
it's so powerful. Absolutely, yeah. Okay, I mean, we can talk about this another. I'd be very interested to know whether you or your audience actually accept that kind of argument and reading about Jana Gana.
I would, because in Jana Gana Mono, in the part that is actually sung as the anthem, you do have this abstract dispenser of India's destiny. But as you move further down the poem, in the later stanzas, there is a more feminine image emerging. So
right.
So I think, what, for me, at least, your point that this is ultimately, beyond, gender divides. And this figure is, in a sense, more abstract than the usual figure of the motherland.
Sure.
Beyond that kind of personification. I think I would certainly agree with you over there.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. But interesting also that, the feminization comes on later. Yeah, that's great. Wonderful. Yeah.
I'm going to quote you a little bit now because there's a question that will follow.
Yeah.
Sonar Bangla, it is not the lyrics that offer the best point of entry, but the melody, which Tagore adopted from Ami Kothaye Pabo Tare, Where Shall I Meet Him, from the Baul tradition. This is what you say. Please, can you reflect on how the aesthetics of the Baul tradition and the eternal search for the Moner Manush is assimilated in the soul of Amar Sonar Bangla? Or rather, how does the Moner Manush align with the gentle mother, also evoked in the poem?
So there's a wonderful collection in English of Tagore's essays on literature and criticism. It was published by OUP India in I think 2001. And it was when I first read that essay, that collection of essays, I had already read The Religion of Man lectures that he gave in the 1930s in Oxford, actually. And so I was aware from that of his own interest in the Baul tradition, a very, very engaged, sustained interest in the Baul tradition. But when later in 2001 those essays came out, I just saw how early on that was in his own career where he was picking up on these things. But also he's had this extraordinary, like many 19th century intellectuals, this extraordinary interest, like Yeats, as we'll discuss later. Interest in folk tradition and you know those popular traditions. So you know I've read a couple of books of scholarship on the Baul tradition and definitely read Tagore on the Bauls and what he had to say about it and I think it was also interestingly that in 2008, I think it was 2008, it's quite recently that their songs have been given UNESCO World Heritage status. I mean, is that right? It's very recent that the intangible heritage.
Yes.
So for Tagore, the Baul tradition was very much a tangible heritage that he took on, and I have always the reason why I got especially interested in this aspect of his work, which is something we will again come back to, is it struck me as one. So there, you know, with all the strains that fed into Tagore's work and thinking, including aspects of Buddhism, but certainly with the Baul tradition, as I saw it, it seemed to me one of the really defining influences on his particular idiosyncratic, what I like to call devotional humanism. It's people often refer to it as a kind of a spiritualized humanism. I think it's a humanism of the world and this world that we inhabit, but it's a devotional humanism, and I get a sense of that coming from the Baul tradition for him. So these are you know, as you mentioned, these songs express a yearning for the Monir Manush, who's a being who's neither wholly divine nor human, neither one thing nor the other. Again, we go back to that, not even androgynous, but it's definitely an inner embodiment of a truth and love. It's a quest, an inner quest, which seemed with when in the essay when I talk about Tagore and he refers to his own. I think I can only think in allusion to the Swadeshi movement, his own inner Swadesh, that creation of that inner Swadesh through love, friendship, your own poetic imagining and work. That's seems to me a very Baul influenced idea that this is what I'm doing. So its interior, its liberation lies in particular. What fascinates me about the Baul tradition, not in ritual, not in institutions, you know, they're outside temple, mosque, church, any institutional structure, but in Shada, which is, you know, the lived practice, the affirmation of lived practice, seems to me essential to that. It's not something we can ritualize. It's something we live. And the musical idiom, again, from what I've learned, is characteristically also, in a sense, simple, cyclic, often cyclic. It's intimate. There's small compass of melody with powerful rhythmic sway, and it's a voice pitched, I think, to my ear and listening to recordings and seeing people perform, to communal singing rather than just sort of virtuoso display. It's meant to be part of community song. It's very clear that Tagore knew and revered that tradition. In fact, I think it wouldn't be misleading. In fact, in Artifacts of Writing, I describe him thinking of himself as a modernist Baul. That's what he was happy to do, taking the Baul tradition into writing as a culture, because of course it was essentially an oral culture. So he's doing that, and he borrowed from that tradition, as we've discussed, for Amar. So I think to that extent, so that's the background. I mean, his deep embeddedness in that. But with specifically with this song, and you asked me also about the relationship between the Moner Manush and the Ma figure, the mother figure. Again, as I've understood it, again partly because of translation issues, but also because of Baul ways of thinking and understanding things, the Munir Manush is definitely not gendered, and is definitely beyond, it's a gender unmarked.
Yes.
So I may be wrong about this, but my sense, the fact that the Ma is explicitly gendered, in a sense, doesn't matter. It's just that is a version of the Munir Manush, which is what this song is celebrating. And it just goes that way, this one. But it's not a commitment to that. It's not it's not some ideological commitment to feminized landscape or whatever. It's just that's the way things are at this moment. So there's the song is, again, to my ear, has this gentle rise and fall of melody. Also really important, and this could be really key also to Tagore at that moment, thinking about it. Why did he go with the feminized Munir Manush, if that's correct? Well, it's also that, in a sense, I sort of take him as, you could maybe read that when we go back to 1905 as deliberately refusing kind of martial pride. It's not martial pride in my place. It's a tender devotion to this place. So I'm not meeting British brutality with counter brutality. I'm meeting British brutality with a disabling, disarming, feminized celebration, which seems to me consistent with a very typical Tagorean response. If you approach me with aggression, I reply with a love, but it's a love that is disabling. It's not a love that's kind of a warm embrace. It's challenging your aggression in that way. So, and the voice again is intimate. The figure seems to me, as I discuss in the essay, solitary. We get more and more localized, and the effect is meditative. The motherland is loved not as an abstraction, but as one's beloved. The Munir Manush transfigured into a landscape. So it's the landscape becomes this. And for me, in Tagore's terms, so I hear the song is a sense of community which is not organized by the state. I mean, I go back to Sujata's mother. I mean, it's not organized by the state, but it's a shared feeling for this inner Swadesh. Absolutely. It's the inner Swadesh is what he's talking about, and the melody acts as a kind of a performance of that inner Swadesh, that Samaj, which is a society of feeling and not of structures and institutions and rituals. Very a Baul idea, but also extraordinary to my ear, and understand, having a sense of the context, an extraordinary way of meeting that first moment of brutal partition.
Thank you. I think that's a very well thought out response.
Okay, thank you.
And this brings me, I think we have time for one last quick question, which
sure.
I absolutely have to ask you, given the emphasis that you placed on the inner space in Rabindranath's thought and its value, and this
Yeah.
brings me directly to think about Yeats.
Yeah.
And how Yeats and Rabindranath both lived during very turbulent political times. Both lived two times when there was a very strong, vigorous nationalist movement raging around them. Yet both resisted very narrow definitions of nationalism.
Yeah.
Would you like to just say something very briefly about the way in which this would have shaped their poetry? Do you see any similarity there?
Yes, I mean, of course, I'm sure as you and all your audience know that Yeats wrote the introduction to the English Gitanjali, and that's a famous text and a fascinating one that's raised all sorts of questions. And yeah, I do see a lot of parallels. A lot of parallels. Yeats had a real interest in Irish folk tradition. Like we've been talking about the Bowls, like Tagore, coming out of that similar 19th century moment of recovering these traditions. Of course, Yeats it's more complicated from a language point of view because he's absolutely firmly embedded in English, but this is often Gaelic tradition, so he's himself relying on translations, and there's all sorts of those ambiguities. And yes, absolutely, they both were trying to negotiate the real tension between a claim for a cultural, definitely a cultural rootedness against colonial incursion, but also not a cultural rootedness that shut itself off from the world. And that they were so those, I think there are those real parallels, and there's also differences, and again, actually there may be I've not thought about the official religious attitudes towards Tagore, but with Yeats, the recovery of pagan Celtic traditions was deeply problematic for Irish Catholic nationalists. He was a really problematic figure for Catholic nationalists because he was recovering these folk pagan, what regarded as pagan traditions. So it was a very charged moment for Yeats and for Tagore in both those ways. But there's also a crucial difference, and I think, and this is you're asking me to be very brief. I'll be very brief with this point. I mean, the goes back to why I've found so much of interest in the Baul tradition, that notion of devotional humanism. It's very clear from Yeats's point of view. Yeats just straightforwardly saw Tagore as an ally in his rather metaphysical project. Ultimately, became a very transcendental metaphysical project, and he just saw he was a kind of an Irish Celtic mystic direction, and he saw Tagore as an ally, as an Eastern mystic. And of course, that's how Tagore often projected himself and was definitely understood in the West. When he became, in the interwar years, he was often celebrated as this Eastern. But what fascinates me, and where the connection comes back to Joyce, is that there is actually, I find, a more powerful connection in the way they resist nationalism in Joyce and Tagore than in Yeats and Tagore. And it's simply that, if you like, Joyce has something much closer to a Tagorean devotional humanism, which is deeply intercultural, deeply open to a fluid conception of identity and movement and constant life, that makes him the powerful ally, which is what I say at the end of the essay of Tagore, much more so than Yeats.
Thank you. I think after this very, very, this fascinating talk, many of our, members of the audience must also be ready with questions. So would you like to, address any questions to Dr. McDonald? Please.
I'm very happy to, so long as people fully understand my what this project means to me. In a sense, it's I've got many questions, as many. I hope I've got more questions for you and things that I can learn from you, as much as there's any attempt that I can have to answer some questions. Because for me, this is a project of it should be for me a project of disorientation.
So if you would like to ask questions, just introduce yourself when you do that, then that will be easier for everyone.
Thank you very much for this wonderful interaction, Dr. McDonald. As a practitioner of Rabindra Sangeet, Rabindranath basically left us an inheritance of more than 2,000 songs. And the songs are basically classified in different classes. One being puja, which is devotion. If I may translate that, I'm not sure, Aditi, how do you translate puja, but like devotion probably, and other being Swadesh. So for me, I just wanted to touch upon the point about gender and Jana Gana, because to me, Jana Gana was an interesting experimentation, according to me, by Rabindranath Tagore. He's an adherent of the Brahmo Samaj, and Brahmo Samaj was critical of a lot of things in canonical Hinduism. But one thing that was constant in most of the Brahmo ideas, philosophies, is that conception of divinity as a male figure, Pita, as they refer to. On the other hand, canonical Hinduism, the conception of God could be masculine, feminine, beyond gender, so forth. So to me, it is interesting that Jana Gana Mana, even before this classification of Jana Gana Mana in the Swadesh part of it, was actually a Brahmo hymn. And so it was always fascinating to me that why would they adopt something that they're critical of? Is because they consider that conception of divinity as the Pita as a very fundamental to the Brahmo conception. So I was very fascinated by that, and I was just curious about what your thoughts were about that, especially because Rabindranath refers to this Bhagya Vidhata as both the King of Kings and the loving mother. So there are several attributes to this. And are there examples of this in contemporary literature? Let's say, not today, probably we have much more acceptable idea of gender and gender inclusion, but at the times that Tagore lived and this experimentation, how would you consider this experimentation? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's a fascinating question, and I would guess that there's part of my response and answer to this would be we go back to the issue of, again, what happens in terms of the song, and then what happens when it becomes an anthem. So that not only is there the issue of what bits of the song get left out for the anthem, which can then make the anthem maybe look a little bit more fixed and determinate. But it came out in our discussion that actually, when you think about the song as a whole, then the fluidity of the thing is greater. So and then of course it would be a question of which context are you applying most powerfully. And I suppose what interests me partly would be that, and I think, am I going to mangle the pronunciation here? But one of my favorite Tagore concepts, literary concepts, which is so much better than the dull English word context, is a Desh Kal Potru. Have I got the pronunciation right?
Desh Kal Patru.
Desh Kal Patru. That notion, and I've, with the discussions I've had with people, so it's fairly straightforward with English to go Desh Kal will be time, place. Place, time, Desh Kal, and then Patro becomes more problematic to translate because in Tagore's context, it probably, where he's using it in that essay, it means the individual author. But it also is, of course, means vessel or pot, which I'd rather like to hang on to that literal notion, because I think what Tagore's saying there is that the work will be produced in a certain context, and it will have, therefore, a certain kind of life and resonance in that context. But that context cannot function as a time, place, pot, where it is trapped forever in, like in some kind of container, and therefore that's what it can only, it only means in relation to that context. He's very open, and in fact, one of his aspects of his notion of world literature is that things will not be trapped in that; they will move into other contexts and other modes, and therefore, when we think about it, we maybe need to not so much think through what exactly is the, is there a fixed gender being articulated in Jana Gana, in the song itself, but rather that how you contextualize it, what tradition you link it to, that it has a flexibility, which is not just an easy anything goes, but actually that, if you put it in the Brahmo tradition, then it does have a certain resonance. But if you anthemize it and you make it an all India project, then it becomes different, and it has that. And I think from a theoretical, conceptual point of view, as much as from a political and poetic point of view, I think Tagore would be open to that. That this isn't a problem that we need to solve, as it were, in the text of the song. It is as much an issue of what frame do you put around it, which is in a sense what our discussion has opened up. Just by the way, in the translation, the King of Kings, I've always understood that to also have a kind of a King James Bible biblical Christian resonance. Would that be completely misleading?
Not really.
Yeah. Because there's lots of other. I end up talking about 106, for instance, from Gitanjali in the essay, where he's open to the Christian tradition being part of the Indian tradition as well, and
Yes.
yeah.
In the Gitanjali 106 poem 106 that you talk about.
Yeah.
Yes. Any other question from anybody else? Well, you've given us a lot to think about, really. So I think people will need a little while to process what you've said.
Yeah.
Sujata, would you like to take over now?
Peter, you have expressed in your article, Tagore's conception of Swadesh is created by one's own knowledge, intelligence, love, and effort. Perhaps most distinctly reflected in the vision of Vishwabharati. In this regard, you mentioned the poem 106, what we call Bharat Tirtho in the original Bengali version of Gitanjali. Kindly, can you elaborate your thoughts on Tagore's Swadesh and its poetic expression in Bharat Tirtho?
Yeah,
His thoughts on Swadesh. His thoughts on Swadesh, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, so the things that I suppose the thing that I've, so in many ways, it's really fascinating for me and the people who are the serious Tagore scholars whose work I rely on and read with interest. They make it very clear that the issue. So we were talking about the issue of Tagore being labeled and understood as this Eastern mystic in his own time in the West, but entirely on kind of Western terms of what that would mean, and not really engaging with the complexities of his own multiple traditions feeding into his work and what he was doing. He was just he just became this kind of brand. As I understood it. And in a way, the choices that he made for the English Gitanjali reinforced that, and some people would also say his own translations reinforced that. I mean, the kind of English that he was playing into gave him kind of, it was a kind of a King James mysticism in his, there's a whole, of course, debate about that translation. But the mere fact that he didn't include 106 from the original Gitanjali in the English one is what's always drawn me to that particular poem, and it's because it is that poem from 1910, which is so deeply immersed in the political circumstances of that moment. It is showing Tagore at his most politically acute at that moment. And so that's why that side of his thinking and his work and project just gets excluded from the Western reception. But he's also extraordinary in that the reason why I focus on that poem at the end is that it's again the one where I see such links with Joyce. Joyce, despite everything about Finnegan's Wake, Joyce is fundamentally has a vision which is deeply rooted in Dublin. It's deeply rooted in that very specific locality. Here I am in this place, even though he lived a life of exile and so on, he everything goes back to Dublin. And the key thing is that Dublin is on a river which opens to the sea. So everything flows into Dublin and everything flows out of Dublin. And that's the parallel I found with Tagore, and in particular with this song. It is a song that is celebrating a very particular moment in a very, very particular place. But what it is invoking is, again, I rely on Kitaki Krish Dyson's translation. He invokes this God in man. It's not this external thing. It's this Baal-like inner Swadesh, but that inner Swadesh that he's invoking is one that is opening all doors. Recognizing the constant cultural, historical flow, linguistic flow that is India's history. And even if you start in a local place, that local place is a part of a region. That region is part of a nation, and ultimately that nation is part of a world in which all these things are constantly moving in and out of each other, being transformed and mixing in this process. And this is not, in my view, easy. It's where I part company with easy postmodern, dare I say, Rushdie-esque notions of hybridity. It's not as simple as that, because it's not just celebrating us all being mongrels, in Rushdian terms. It's actually recognizing that the avenues, how you encounter the world, starts in your village. That's where it'll start. So everybody's starting point will be different. It'll be local. And so, yes, Joyce will start everything in Dublin. Tagore will start everything in Kolkata or on that shore in India's concourse with, the translation is concourse with humankind. So, but he's also recognizing the pain of that particular colonial moment. But even in that pain of that colonial moment, he's also not shutting off the West. And he's saying, that's going to be open. So it's why it becomes a vital thing. And it's also the thing that I perhaps haven't mentioned is the other reason why Tagore, is a kind of a hero of mine, is that he also refuses the simple binary of, either you're nationalist or you're some sort of cosmopolitan. Because there's a wonderful phrase where he in one of his essays where he refers to what he calls the colorless vagueness of cosmopolitanism, and I understand that as coming from the same thing. That actually, no, if we're just going for some easy cosmopolitan utopian vision, then we forget about that locality, that specific. You're embedded. As a human being, you're finite. You're deeply embedded in a particular language, culture, moment, history. And the key thing for Tagore is not to deny that or to wish that away or pretend it's not there, but to keep that open and keep those avenues open and keep that locality constantly in communication with every other increasingly larger sphere with which you're also inevitably entangled, not to close those off. So that's why that poem becomes so important at the end of the essay.
Thank you for your insightful response.
Thanks very much.
There is a pardon me here. There's a question in the chat box from Dr. Rajkumari Basu, and I can read that out if that's okay.
Yeah.
Can the gender issue in Jana Gana Mana be explained on the basis of Ardhanarishwar concept of Shiva, the androgynous traits of Adhinayaka in the song? Dr. McDonald, Ardhanarishwar is a composite form of Shiva with his consort Parvati. If you want to take that question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I will definitely, once we get into this level of detail, I would have to rely much more on you and than anything that I can know or contribute to that. But it is certainly one of the things that I was aware of, and from the scholarship and having read it, was the difference between the Brahmo traditions. There's similar sort of things have emerged of where Tagore's attitude towards the Baul tradition is also very selective. There's certain aspects of the Baul tradition which there's a sense in which he rather sort of sanitized the Baul tradition. There's a visceral side of the Baul tradition which he doesn't say much about. The celebration of the body. He doesn't say much about it in. So there's a selective approach to those things, and so yeah, I have always understood that within the canonical Hindu tradition there's this tremendous openness to gender complexity, movement, and so on. So I can see that, but beyond what I've said already, I could again I would probably come back with a similar response to your question, is to say, well. It would be then, yes, the song would be itself open to recognizing that if you work the links from, it's a bit like what we've been talking about. If you work the links, your song is your local starting point. If you work the links into that tradition, well, then it's going to have that sort of effect. That aspect of the gender thing will come out. But if you put it into this other one, it'll have a different effect, because there isn't a simple, straightforward, fixed position, and I think that would be as applicable in this context as in the question that you raised.
Then I think we will then wind up our session. I would like to extend my vote of thanks on behalf of Gitika Trust. I would like to express our deepest gratitude to Dr. Peter McDonald. Thank you for gracing us with your presence, for enunciating your ideas so articulately, for taking our questions and responding to them insightfully. We deeply appreciate your spirit, not only to make others my own people, but to make my own people others. A favorite quote of Tagore from Chandidas, which you had referred to me earlier in one of our conversations.
Absolutely.
Our sincere thanks also to Dr. Aditi Dasgupta for moderating this interaction. Aditi, you and your constant support has been invaluable in bringing this event to life. A special thank you to our organizing team for working tirelessly behind the scene to ensure that the event ran smoothly. Your hard work and dedication made this a memorable occasion. Finally, thank you to all present today for being with us, raising questions and honoring the memory of Kalyani Sengupta. Your presence and support means a lot to us. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. good afternoon, or good morning, depending on the corner of the globe you are in.
Thank you.
Namaskar.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been such a pleasure.
It's a pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye.